Welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. Storytelling is what connects us as humans, and for brands, it is no different. A well-told story can effectively position your brand in the minds and hearts of your audience, and can convert thoughts and feelings into results and revenue. On this show, we dive into the unique and recurring principles of world-class storytellers from every walk of life, to help you level up your storytelling skills and knowledge to drive real, measurable results for you and your organization. Here's your host, Paul Furlong.
Hello and welcome to Rule the World of the Art and Power of Storytelling. I'm your host, Paul Furlong, Creative Director at Opus Media. Today's guest is Michael Davis, who's a professional speaker, speech coach and author. Michael's created a business which gives people the tools and processes to accomplish much more than they ever believed they could. He's survived bankruptcy, 2 major health scares, and the current US political season. He's currently working on books 4 and 5 of his Sell More with Stories Kindle book series. He's also got a new video home study course, How to Be a Successful Speaker. There are other books that he's written for Kindle. He's got the book on storytelling and Sell More with Stories. And if you go to his website, you can find his 52 storytelling tips, which are free weekly audio files that will be sent to you on how to sell better using story. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Michael Davis. Well, hi, Michael, and welcome to Rule the World. It's great to be able to talk to you today.
Thank you, Paul. It's a great pleasure to be here and talking with you from the States.
So can we start by you telling me a little bit about yourself and where your passion for story comes from?
I'll share a quick story with you on why I teach storytelling and public speaking skills. One day, my dad and I were standing in the front lobby of Friday's restaurant, which is a big chain over here in the States. And it was a typical August day here in the Midwest. It was hot and humid, and we're standing there with a bunch of people in the front lobby with a 30-minute wait. Even the pints we were drinking just wasn't cutting it. And while we're standing there, a man in his late 30s walks up to my dad. He's wearing a black T-shirt, blue jeans, and white Nikes. And he says, "Mr. Davis?" My dad said, can I help you?" He said, "Yes, actually, you already have." He said, "My name's Craig. You might not remember me, but you were my 7th grade biology teacher back in 1975. And Dad said, "Sorry, I don't remember." He said, "That's okay. I just wanted to thank you." He said, "I've been looking for you for 25 years. He said, "You helped me back then in a way I can never thank you enough for." He said, "I was like a typical 14-year-old struggling, but my family was going through a lot of difficulty. And because of you and the confidence you helped me find, I had a much better experience." And he said, "More importantly, that class laid the foundation for my career. I'm now a doctor. And I've been hoping to run into you all this time because I wanted to thank you for what you've done for me." My dad said, "Oh, no, thank you. I can't tell you how much you made my day." And I was standing there watching this, and it occurred to me that if I do this, I just started speaking at the time, and I thought if I do this the right way, I could touch the future and impact lives like you couldn't believe. And it was that kind of commitment that I wanted. My dad was a great teacher. He lifted people to a much higher level than they thought they could go. I want to do the same thing. I just do it as a speaker, storyteller, and coach and author.
Excellent. So why do we tell stories?
Human beings have always told stories in the way we do because it creates pictures. We think in pictures, obviously, and it creates more of an emotional connection. The business world in the 20th century got so caught up in statistics, facts, figures, and in the late part of the century, PowerPoints loaded with that same information. We lost sight of how we connect with people. It bridges gaps. It builds trust faster.
And what does that do for our psychology? How does the psychology affect how we respond to the stories as opposed to the facts and the figures?
Well, it does create a deeper level of trust and empathy. There's been research done on the physiological impact, if you want to go even beyond the psychology, where cortisol is a stress hormone. And many times when people are selling, for example, or they're in front of a room giving a presentation and they're bombarding people with facts and figures, we intuitively know when people are not listening to us. And it creates a lot of stress in both the audience and the speaker or the salesperson. Well, oxytocin, which is what they call the trust hormone or the bonding hormone, is released when we tell stories. If we tell the stories the right way, that lowers the stress of the cortisol. It breaks down barriers, and it makes us, it improves our communication to where people are actually hearing us and they get the point of what we're trying to get across.
So I imagine in a lot of the cases that you come across when you're dealing with businesses and storytellers, that the stories that they're telling maybe aren't as effective as they could be, which is why they're talking to you. So
Absolutely.
So why aren't most business stories effective?
Biggest reason, I think, is insecurity. Or, well, actually, I should say there are two. One is insecurity, especially with newer leaders, newer salespeople. They just don't have the confidence to get to the heart of the matter. So they want to impress people with their knowledge. So what they do is in turn, they bombard people with so much information. I'm sure you've sat in a workshop, a seminar, a speech, or even a sales presentation where at one point you thought, I got it. You probably got talked out of buying something because of all the information, right? So that's one reason. The other reason, I believe people are so passionate about their subject that they just talk on and on and on. They don't check in with the listener. So consequently, they've bombarded with somebody with a lot of information they don't need. You can tell a good story in 60 to 120 seconds and make the point.
So what does that look like, the good story told in such a short space of time, 60 to 120 seconds?
A good story has to immediately grab the interest with a character who's compelling and as soon as possible introduce conflict. You think about the great stories. I know you're in the movie business also. Think about the greatest, most memorable stories are the ones that have conflict. I mean, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I grew up on the movie. I mean, that conflict between Luke and Darth Vader carried through the entire series. Well, and and another key to conflict, it has to escalate quickly. So that's how you grab people's attention with that interesting character of the conflict, and at some point it has to be resolved. And that resolution is actually the lesson that the audience or the listener want. It's a result they want. And then once you have the resolution, you have to show how the character has changed. I know this is huge in selling, Paul. A lot of times salespeople go out and they talk about their product and all the bells and whistles, but they don't share stories that talk about other clients who have actually their lives are better because of the product or service. And I think a lot of times that's why people don't buy, because they don't have that compelling story with a conclusion that shows a new end result.
And how can you make sure that in those 60 seconds to 120 seconds, what you're saying is relevant and useful to the people that you're telling the story to, as opposed to just being a rambling monologue?
I think the most important action you can take is to know your audience, to know your market. I've worked with so many individuals who struggle over how should I craft my message? How should I craft my presentation? And there's a simple solution, but very few people do it. Ask your market. For example, in my world, speech coaching, I go out and I will survey people. And I know some people are getting tired of hearing surveys or getting surveys, but just go ask 2 or 3 questions. What is your biggest struggle as a presenter? When you tell stories, why do you feel that people aren't reacting? Just find out what they think they need. You can build that into your narrative. Now, sometimes they don't know what they need. Steve Jobs was brilliant at creating products that we didn't know we needed. 10 years ago when he introduced the iPhone, I thought, there's no way I'd buy that. And now it's on my hip. So we have to take their answers and kind of read between the lines to say some obvious points that the solutions they need, but sometimes we got to bring a new solution that they've never thought of. And that's how you take that information, then you build your story around that. Here's a new way that you can be or live or think, feel or do, and you build that in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense. Thank you. And you've mentioned a couple of things that you put into all of your stories, conflict and the things that you've mentioned there. Do you have a specific strategy or format or structure that you use when planning a story, or is that entirely based on the research that you do before you go in to talk to the client?
Actually, there is a 7-step formula I use. I call it the 7 C's to sensational storytelling. The 7 very quickly are characters, who are the people involved, what are the circumstances that they're in, what is the conflict, character, circumstance, conflict, cure, that's where they learn the lesson. The 5th is the change. The 6th is the carryout message. Now, think of a carryout message as a 1-sentence tagline. Think of Nike, just do it. Or other famous companies that have those 1 sentences that basically summarize the point of the story. And then the 7th C, which is the most important, is conversation or dialogue. When we think about the story that I just told you about my dad, to bring that story to life, I try to pull you into the scene by giving the dialogue between my dad and Craig, his former student. I could have just told the story. My dad, this man walked up to us. He said this to my dad. My dad was happy to hear that, and this guy was thankful to run into my dad. The facts are the same, but it's not compelling. It's almost like a report. So that's the formula that we use, the 7 C's.
So I wonder if we can break this down a little bit and go through each of them in a little bit of detail. So let's start with the character. How do you go about creating the character for your story? In the story you told about your dad, Craig was obviously a real person, your dad was a real person. How do you know which parts of their character to use? And how do you structure that character? How do you tell about that character in your story?
Well, it depends on how far along somebody that I'm working with, how far along they are in the process. If they're just now learning storytelling, I don't want to bombard them. So I'll say, give a quick 1 or 2 sentence description. For Craig, for example, I shortened it up for our interview here, but he was wearing a black T-shirt, blue jeans, and white Nikes. What does that tell you about him? Oh, he's in his late 30s too. What kind of picture is that?
To me, he's relatively young, as you said, mid to late 30s. He's got a certain element of style about him. I've certainly got a picture of what he looks like in my mind.
Good.
And probably young, knowing you and what have you, probably younger than your dad as well.
Yes.
So it gives me some context.
That's the key. And what I find is you want to flavor a scene with a character description. And that is what he was wearing. I can still remember it, and it was like 15 years ago. And it was stylish. But what you don't want to do when you're describing a character is over-describe. Now, see, he also had black hair, wore wire-rimmed glasses. If I start to get too detailed in my description, I'm pushing you, the audience, out of my scene. I want you to fill in the other parts so that now you feel like you're standing right there next to my dad and me and Craig. And there's something else I did, which is part of the circumstance, which I'll jump ahead to number 2, is what was the feeling of that scene as I was telling it to you?
A little bit of confusion. Your dad hadn't recognized Craig, but Craig obviously knew exactly who your dad was.
Exactly. Think about how the front lobby, how did that feel?
Probably a little, for you and your dad, a little unsure. For Craig, probably maybe a little embarrassed.
I'm talking about even the weather.
Okay, yeah. I've got a good image of what the whole place looked like, felt like.
It was crowded, it was hot, people were sweating. By doing that and not over describing it just enough, now you're right there with us. Now, there is an advanced storytelling process we use, Paul, once we get into the dialogue, is you can describe characters through dialogue. So let's say, for example, that my dad did know Craig in that scene. Craig would have approached my father and said, "Mr. Davis," and my dad would have said, "Craig, look at you. Man, you look like you must have lost 30 pounds. And when did you dye your hair black?" See, again, in a conversational, or in dialogue, I should say, that brings the story to life, but you've also just picked up a lot of information about this character that we don't need to give a paragraph description of.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't fit in the story I told because my dad didn't recognize the guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So once you got the character and you got the circumstances, so the crowded lobby, the hot weather, would you add anything else to the circumstances, or is that similar to character, a couple of lines?
Well, what I try to do, and again, I did a little shortened version here for us, is we call this using the VAX, which is the senses. V is visual, A auditory, K kinesthetic, S smell. Now, confession, I left a piece out I normally do, and I like to talk about the smell of the barbecue sauce that was drifting out from the restaurant. So you've got a smell, you've got a kinesthetic feel because of the sweat and the heat. You've got the visual because I described how Craig was dressed. And I didn't talk sound, but I could have said the noise of the crowd made it hard for us to talk. You know, I've told that story so many times, I change it up because sometimes I don't want to hear the same thing coming out of my mouth. But the more you can put in, the more you involve the senses, the more you're going to reach all your audience members because everybody reacts differently. They have their own preferred sensory style.
And so what about the conflict? Obviously in the story there, we've got the start of the conflict, but maybe some stories don't seem like they have conflict in. What are we looking for to try and find the conflict?
Yeah, and that story is an everyday story. And the conflict, and you pointed it out earlier when I asked you about the feeling, you said the embarrassment or the confusion. And my dad was a little confused, and you picked up embarrassment. I didn't even have to say it. Now, truth be told, I don't blame somebody for not remembering a student from 30 years earlier, 25 years earlier, but he did feel that. So those are the little conflicts that we have in day-to-day life that are more relatable. When I talked earlier about Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, not too many of us have a conflict where we got to battle to the death with our father. Okay? Makes for a great movie. And we still relate to it because of father-son issues or child-parent issues. But what I described is something that we all face every day. We run across people we meet, and it's like, oh, God, I don't remember this guy. And also the conflict of Craig when he was younger that my dad helped resolve. Those are what I call more subtle conflicts, but they're in there. And then there was a third one. My dad and I were standing in a lobby. It was hot and sweaty. We're drinking the beer, and we're still not feeling better. Conflict doesn't have to be something major or life-changing per se, but it's relatable.
And then obviously the cure follows that.
Absolutely.
And I imagine in business, if in a business story, if there's no cure, then there's not really a point to the end of the story. So
Exactly.
Is there anything else that's pertinent to the cure part of it that I've missed?
Well, a couple of ideas to think, not so much that you missed it, but the cure in my story with my dad, that story I tell because I want people to understand why I do what I do. Now, I could stand up. Well, let me ask you a question before we go any further. Now, I know you did, obviously, as a good interview, you did some research on me, but if you had never met me before and didn't know anything about me, and I told you that story about me, if you were in the market, Paul, for a speech coach or a presentation or storytelling coach, Would you be open to talking with me further about what I do, just hearing that story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, my question is why?
Because you heard what your dad had done for Craig,
Right.
and you said that you could do the same for people like Craig or people like me. So to me, it would be worth having a bit more of an exploration with you.
Okay. I always ask why, because if you look at traditional selling, I didn't tell you about my background. I said nothing about my process. I didn't tell you what my cost, my fee. I said none of that, and yet you're still interested.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a point that I'm trying to, well, the reason I've written my books and I do my speeches and my workshops is if you want to stand out in the world of selling or even leadership, which is just selling ideas, give people insight into who you are and why you do what you do, which I really got this idea from Simon Sinek in his book, Start With Why, and that fabulous TED Talk he did. That is going to set you apart. And selling is like dating. Not too many people in the world meet somebody and within 2 minutes they're getting married. I know in some cultures maybe it happens, but for most of us it is a process. And all we're trying to do in the beginning is tell a quick story to grab people's attention to say, hey, let's talk further. And then you tell another story and another and another. And that's you weave that into the selling process. And now you've got somebody who's trusts you. They want to do business with you because you're likable. And you've shown them the benefits that they can get from working with you, which goes back to the cure. The cure shows an end result. In my story, the cure was my dad set an example for me that I want to follow in what I do.
And that then leads to the change.
It does. Now, one other part of the cure that's very important that most salespeople and speakers miss. They try to make themselves the guru. Every story has a hero. Joseph Campbell talked about the hero's journey. You are the hero of your own story, but you should not be the guru. Because people who come across as hero and guru, because they're not somebody we can relate to because they either seem very special or very arrogant. Okay? You've seen those people and so have I. My dad in that story was my guru, my mentor. He taught me through his example. So the change, and I didn't get into it because I kept the story short. The change for me was I was struggling at that time to decide, do I want to be a speaker? At the time, even being a coach wasn't on my radar, but do I want to be a speaker? And he taught me by seeing the end result that Craig had years down the road. Yes, I want to do that for people. That's my driving force. If I can lift people higher, wow, that to me would fulfill my life's mission.
And that's the change in your story.
That is the change. Yeah. Yes, that's the change. And that from then on, I just took off on a new path. Now, let's take it to everyday sales, for example. What your prospective client wants to see is how will their lives be better? And how can they get the same result that this other client got?
And I guess that comes into the carryout message, does it? That all bleeds together?
Yeah, the carryout message. And by the way, not every story has all 7. The more you have, the better. But they don't have to have all 7. I didn't really put a carryout message in there because it's more of a teaching story. But the carryout message could simply be this. My goal is to lift people higher and help them achieve more than they ever thought they could. That's it. Now, my tag on is I just happen to do that as a speaker, coach, and author.
And how do you keep... You've talked about dialogue a little bit and dialogue bringing out character details and all the rest of it, but how do you know which parts of the dialogue to use? How do you not just go on and on and on about he said, she said, he said, she said? How can you whittle that down to what's absolutely necessary?
A good dialogue should have no more than 3 sentences for each character. So what I challenge people to do is sit back and say, what is the essence of this dialogue? What point are you trying to get across? In the dialogue between Craig and my dad, The point was, you had a major impact on me, and I want to thank you. I mean, that was the end result. And that transfers over for me as a speaker and coach, because that's what I want to provide to people. That's the idea that I'm trying to sell. Before that, it really takes a lot of testing, Paul. Whenever people speak or tell stories, I say, you've got to share this with people, and you've got to get their feedback. Is it going on too long? Is it supporting your main point? But you should never do just straight dialogue. For example, when I was between my dad and Craig, I would say, Craig said, Mr. Davis, you had this impact on me, you made these changes, helped me through a tough time. And my dad said, no, thank you. You don't want to sound like a stage play. So it's okay to pop in a he said, or then my dad said, so you know who's speaking. A couple of tips, more advanced tips that can help is you can put the name of the recipient in the dialogue. So you don't have to say, for example, let me think about the story. Oh, a young man walked up to my dad and said, Mr. Davis. Well, obviously, that's being directed at my dad. Dad said, can I help you? You already have Mr. Davis. That keeps me from having to say, Dad said, Craig said, Dad said, Craig said. So you just mix and match.
That makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of people find the dialogue maybe the hardest bit to incorporate into the story, regardless of how you're telling it.
It is, Paul, because what I do is I look at a story and I say, how can this be turned into dialogue? For example, there's a great Hollywood screenwriter and screen consultant. You may know the name because of your background, Michael Haig.
Yep.
Okay, Michael gives 2 terrific tips on how to introduce a character, and you can do this with dialogue, or you can also just do it as a general description. You can describe how a person is dressed, which I did with Craig. You can also describe how that person enters a room. If you're talking about a teenager, for example, who clearly they're full of lack of confidence and insecurity, he kind of pulled the door open and peeked in and slinked into the room and hovered over by the food. Well, that tells you a lot right there about the kid. Versus, she burst into the room followed by an entourage and everybody turned toward her. Don't need a long explanation. You could put those 2 descriptions in a line of dialogue.
That's brilliant. And I think those 7 C's are a really good way to regardless of what story you're telling, be it for a sales meeting, a presentation, a film, television, whatever it is, that's a really great way of looking at your story.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that with us. Sure. I've sat in sales meetings with clients and they've said, oh, we don't really have a story to tell. And I always think that's not the case. They've obviously got a story to tell. What would you say to them?
I get this. Thank you for that question, because I get this all the time. People will step back. Whenever I do workshops, I will ask people, raise your hand if you've ever climbed to the top of Everest, you have gone to the bottom of the ocean to find Titanic, or you've won an Olympic gold. Aside from the occasional smart aleck who thinks, I'll raise my hand, nobody does. And I say, look around the room. Now, tell me, or raise your hand if you've ever had a conflict with a spouse, maybe had to deal with an obstinate child or had troubles at work. All hands go up. My point is, you have something in common with everybody in this room, because that's the kind of story that people relate to. I love reading stories of people who went to the top of Everest and almost died, or Robert Ballard going and finding Titanic, or let's say Michael Phelps this year, huge comeback story. Those are great. I can't relate. Now, they might be able to tell those stories into perseverance, or how do you keep your eye on the prize. but most of those people don't make for compelling speakers, or I shouldn't say compelling, they don't make relatable speakers or storytellers or salespeople. But the everyday events are the ones you can relate to.
Like bumping into somebody in the lobby.
Absolutely. Or standing in that lobby that's so hot. It's like, God, I know I've been there before, but the food smelled so good, I wasn't going to leave. We can relate to those. And those seem to be the most impactful stories over the long run.
And how do you help the client find those stories? If you were sitting with them and they've said that to you and you explain that, what process do you go through to dig a bit deeper to find those stories?
The first thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to determine what point do you want to get across. If it's a sales talk, not every sales presentation is meant to consummate the sale in that meeting. And we're talking industrial sales or big corporate sales, that can take months. So we've got to figure out each meeting or each presentation, what's the point? Boil it down to a foundational concept. That foundational concept now becomes the measuring stick. If the story supports that point, then we can put it in and work on it. If not, leave it out. And this is hard for most people. I know you do this. I'm sure you've gone through it yourself when you put together a short film or a long movie and you fall in love with your material. And we need somebody to sit back and say, wait a minute, is this pushing the narrative forward? Or are we getting bogged down and sidetracking people? It's that phrase that my coach shared with me, I think I mentioned to you earlier, is a confused mind does nothing. A clear mind says go.
That's brilliant. That's really good advice, particularly for me the next time we get that, and for those out there listening as well. So, Michael, I'm very aware of the time, so I'd love to just ask you a couple of questions that we ask all of our guests, just to get your opinions on this. So, to your mind, who is the greatest storyteller of all time, and why?
I'm not even really a religious person, but I have to say Jesus Christ, or even the other, Muhammad, Buddha, religious or spiritual leaders, because what they had to do was take a very abstract concept and make it tangible and real and emotional. And when you look at the number of followers each of those people have had over the centuries, pretty good storytellers. Because they had to get across moral, ethical, spiritual ideas and make them stick. So to me, without a doubt, they are the most powerful storytellers. And the evidence that we still tell their stories thousands of years later is the best proof I can come up with.
And can you recommend any good books or websites, blogs, podcasts about storytelling?
Oh, there are so many books. My favorite is The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs. That's written by Carmine Gallo. He also wrote a book on storytelling, and they're all on. It's like having all the phone numbers in your phone. I don't remember the phone numbers. Just look up Carmine Gallo for books. Also, I know you were going to ask me this, and I knew I'd flame out. It's my coach, Craig Valentine, is a world champion of public speaking from Toastmasters. He also is a master salesman and storyteller. He has a terrific book that is called World Class Speaking. Now that gets into speaking, but there's a part of that talks about storytelling, which serves as the foundation of a lot of what I teach. Those would be great starting points. TED Talks.
Just to see how the story is told.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant.
So the key to storytelling is go watch other people. Trying to think who it was. It was Sir Ken. I can't remember Ken's last name. It's the most watched TED Talk of all time. Go watch that. Just type in Sir Ted, top viewed TED Talk, and you'll get it. That one he's a terrific storyteller. He's got great humor in there.
Brilliant.
Don't try to repeat or be other people, but just pick up ideas on how to quickly get to the point and work humor into those.
That's excellent. Well, I think, Michael, we might need to do this again in a couple of months, because I'd love to talk to you about including humour and your 3D storytelling as well, but I know that we don't have time today. So can you just tell us a little bit more about where we can find you, maybe online or in bookstores or what have you?
Sure, absolutely. My website is speakingcpr.com. Our tagline is "Give life to your business presentations and stories." On there, your viewers may be interested in this. I have a series of tips. It's called 52 Storytelling Tips. You can sign up there. It's a free service. And every week you'll get a 5-minute audio with a PDF transcription of each lesson. Those tips actually served as the foundation for my first book, which was the book on storytelling. You can get that on Kindle. And also I have a series of books on Kindle called Sell More with Stories. Are you familiar with the old 1 Minute Manager series of books?
Yep.
Okay, I was inspired by that. So when I wrote my first book, I thought, this is a lot of information, but I didn't really tell too many stories in here. So I created a series of stories about a fictional financial planner who was struggling to build her business, and tried to demonstrate different parts of the story process through that. So they can find that on Kindle, Amazon with the Kindle series. It's called Sell More with Stories.
Excellent. We will be sure to do that. So all that's left to say to you today, Michael, is thanks very much for talking to us and for sharing your knowledge with us. And I look forward to doing this again sometime soon.
I'd be more than happy to. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Rule the World. Be sure to rate, review and subscribe to the show, and visit weareopusmedia.com for more resources based on today's topic, as well as access to more episodes that will help you develop your storytelling abilities. That's weareopusmedia.com. Thank you, and see you next time.